Few months ago, I did a video where I described multiple ways of upgrading the protection level of the old Soviet-era SSH68 steel helmets, as well as showing two that are successfully modified. I did this video mainly with the aim of potentially helping the few Ukrainians who might have seen it and who might not have been issued a modern helmet, even Ukraine being an ex-Soviet state and so having inherited a huge stockpile of Soviet military gear. Since then, I have learned of the existence of a new Russian helmet, whose designs seems to go in a similar direction as some of the upgrade possibilities I have discussed in my video, as well as being similar in concept to the 2000s era 6B14. This head helmet is called kolpak-20 and is made by NPO SM apparently. The kolpak-20, despite how cursed the production process look,
No, God!
seems to offer acceptable ballistic protection for modern standard, being rated at BR2, which is 9 by 21 gyolza, which would more or less sit between Western NIJ2A, which is 9 by 19 Parabellum, and NIJ2, which is 357 Magnum, and would probably, assuming the UHM VPE to be at least as strong as the 2000s era Russian Aramid, which it should be, give it a fragmentation protection at least comparable to that of the 6B14, with a V50 against a 6.3mm steel BBs of more than 400 meters per second. I have therefore decided to see if I could build something at least equivalent to the kolpak-20, and doing so while avoiding doing the same errors as NPO-SM did, and hopefully do it in such a way that it is easily replicable by the people in Ukraine. The goal being to propose a cheap and easy way for the Ukrainian people to turn the stockpiles of all Soviet steel helmets into modern enough helmets, and so maybe helping some people who might not have yet received a modern composite helmet. For this project, I will use a helmet who shares a very similar design with both the SSH39, SSH40 and SSH60 shell-wise. The helmet I will be using is a Czechoslovakian VZ53, as his suspension system was already damaged beyond proper use, and the VZ53 having only 3 holes in its shell, like the SSH39, which will offer me less possibilities of using the screws to keep the composite liner in place, and so it will be the hardest route, meaning that if I succeed, everyone using SSH40 or SSH60 will succeed as well and have an easier time doing so, as they would have twice as many retention points for the composite liner. This VZ53 shell has the same size as SSH40 and SSH60 in their size 2, which is, by far, the average and also the most common size for those helmets. So I will not have more empty space to play with as you will probably have. The first step on our upgrading journey will be to separate the shell from the inside. They are linked by 3 rivets. We will therefore take care of those. The good old faulty grit abrasive cloth with aluminum oxide will do wonder at grinding the dome-shaped rivet into a flat-shaped rivet. Now that the rivet's heads are flat, we can properly make a dimple in them with a center punch, without the risk of the center punch slipping around in a random direction. with a small dimple near the center of every rivet's head, we can finally begin the drilling. I personally used a wire-powered drill, not a battery one, in order to have more power and not run out of battery in the middle of the work. The power of this drill is 500 watt. And the drill bit I used was an HSS1, of course, as it is for metal, and the diameter was 4.5 mm. You probably noticed that it is very short. It is because a few months ago I snapped it in two by accident by forcing too much, and so I kept the half of it and resharpened it with my angle grinder to make it usable once again. I suggest that you dip the tip of your drill bit into some cold water and apply a bit of cold water on the area you want to drill in beforehand, in order to keep the metal cold a little bit longer and to serve as a visual indicator as to when the metal is heating, as water will evaporate at around 100 Celsius, which is still below the point where the metal will lose its temper, which means that when you see the water evaporate, you know you need to cool down, to let things cool down, but it is not yet ruined. Now that the heads of the rivets have been hollowed by having been drilled in, we can easily use a center punch to push whatever little material remains on the rim of the head towards the center, in order to remove any grip the rivet's head have on the helmet's shell, which will allow us to easily liberate the shell's original holes and later reuse such holes for assembling the new inside to the helmet, rather than drilling new holes straight into the shell like NPO-SM did, which caused the risk of potentially hurting the shell's structural integrity, as well as putting more strain on the tools, as the rivets are made of mild steel, while the shell is made of hardened steel. It is to anyone's guess what is the easiest to drill in. A small extra step that I personally have to do with my VZ53 that you will probably not have to do if you end up using an SSH40 or an SSH60 shell is to enlarge the hole in the shell, as on the VZ53 the hole's diameter barely reached 3 mm and my screw were slightly above this diameter. If the screws you plan to use have a diameter inferior to 4 mm, you will most likely not need to perform this step on your SSH40 or your SSH60's shell. I also use the opportunity to weight the helmet shell on the scale. It turns out that the helmet shell is 1050 grams, which is 250 grams lighter than the former complete helmet. We now enter into the most nerdy and complicated phase of the build, the protection upgrade. First of all, we will look at how the kolpak-20's composite liner is made, so we have a general idea of what we could do and what we could improve to have better performance. As we can see in NPO's presentation video, the workers, for each layer, take 3 pieces and stitch them together, and they do that for every single layer. Then they place each layer in a slightly different position than the previous one, in order to not have all the stitched areas following each other, as doing so would create a weak spot. That method seems very similar to how most composite helmets are made. The material used for the kolpak-20 seems to be some sort of UHMVPE, which stand for Ultra High Molecular Weight Polyethylene, which is a composite using polyethylene fibers having very long polymers inside. But then we get something a little bit strange. The layers, instead of being thermocompressed, which basically consist of compressing all the layers together while being heated up to a point that is lower than the melting point, but high enough to make the surface of each layer become sticky, so that the layers stick to each other and fuse together, while the fibers themselves are not melted and stay intact, and their polymers stay intact as well. This is the thermocompression. But instead of doing that, they seem to manually take all the UHMVP layers to add a strange transparent film on top of it, and then add the steel shell on top of it, and they seem to manually, by hand, compress all of that together. And we can also see on the photos where we can see the composite liner being dismantled from the shell, that on the rim we have some remnants of that film with some paint sticked on it, which suggests that they just add a transparent adhesive or a transparent glue piece between the PE and the shell, and just mechanically by hand compress that together until it sticks, which is some kind of just simple gluing basically. The issue with this method is that the layers aren't bound to each other in a stiff way, meaning that one of UHMVP's already existent drawback, which is a high backface deformation, will in this case be even greater than it is supposedly most of the time. Some example of UHMVP having huge backface deformation can be found if we look at either various cheap UHMVP helmets sold online on platforms such as Wish, or if we look at the American IHPS. What further intrigued me is that the Russian decided to use his gluing method despite using UHMVP in a thin film format, not in a thick, simple fabric format like the Western Spectra Shield, but in a thin film format. And the UHMVP in this film format is so smooth on the touch that it is waterproof, which causes me to question the method, because if something is so smooth that even water cannot get in, I suspect gluing to it to be very difficult. And so I did on my side two tests, one with some regular grey duct tape and one with some double faces adhesive tape, and the results were kind of surprising. Basically, what happened is that when trying to pull the tape out, the fibers came with it. The fibers were pulling out, which means that the strength with which the tape was sticking to the UHMVP was at least equal to the strength with which the fibers were held together. This very intriguing result is a very good news, as it will allow to easily stick the UHMVP to the inner side of the steel helmet shell using tape, allowing to not have to dig into the realm of thermolamination, which would have been difficult, as it would have needed to find a temperature both adequate for the UHMVP and low enough to not kill the steel shell's heat treatment, or having to use a sacrificial shell to laminate the UHMVP inside and then pull the liner out and then reinsert it into the final shell, which would have been complicated as well and would have required a sacrificial shell using exclusively for the lamination. However, the problem of excessive backface deformation remains, and since we want something better than the flawed Russian kolpak-20, we need something to prevent this BFD, because only holding the UHMVP with tape will let excessive BFD. We can see it with the example I will be showing you with a 6-layer sample shot with a pellet shot through a 19.9 joules air pellet rifle, the projectile being a gamma-lethal pellet. It is a steel core sabot round, and it can go through 1 mm of mild steel, and when shot at this sample, the 6-layer catched it, no problem, but as you can see, the BFD was still noticeable. It was actually enough to push the sample a bit into the mud that I used as a support to simulate a wearer, and it was even enough to burst open the duct tape on the back. And it is only with a slightly less than 20 joule projectile. Now imagine with something of multiple hundreds of joules like a pistol round. This type of BFD is totally unacceptable. Since UHMVP is watertight, there is simply no way, I think, that the epoxy resin could properly impregnate the fibers themselves and get inside of them and to hold the whole thing together. as a rigid shell, in the same way I could with other synthetic fabric, like polyester, nylon, carbon fiber, fiberglass, aramid, PBO and other stuff. Therefore, the use of a second type of fabric will be needed, something that can be properly epoxy laminated in order to create a thin, light and rigid inner shell beneath the UHMVPE in order to reduce its BFD. As I already had some leftover 240 GSM aramid fabric from another project, I decided to use this for the inner shell. But since the role of the thin inner shell is just to be a rigid shell that could diminish the UHMVPE's BFD, any synthetic fabric that holds epoxy properly could technically do the job. So if you do not have the budget for something fancy like aramid or carbon fiber, just use some cheap fiberglass welding blanket or some thick nylon fabric like 1000 denier instead. Just make sure do not put too many layers. You need to manage the empty space inside of your shell, because once all the composite will be placed inside of your shell, you need to still have enough void between that composite and your head to place some thick enough pads of foam in order to absorb the impact. Speaking of finding the proper amount of composite material to add, we do not know exactly how much UHMVPE is placed inside the kolpak-20, and since we do not know either the V50 rating against fragments, I have decided that I would look back on the 6B14, since we have more data on it. So, here is basically what we know about the 6B14. We know it is an SSH60 with added aramid composite on the inner side of the shell, with some few details modified regarding the suspension and the chin strap and so on. And what we know is the surface that is protected is 10.5 square decimeter. We know the mass is, depending on which sources we ask, between 1.7 and 1.9 kilograms. And we know that the V50 ratings is, depending on which sources we ask, between 400 meters per second and 550 meters per second against a 6.3 mm diameter steel BBs. We also know that the Kalashnikov magazine article regarding the SSH68, article called Last Steel, speak in the end, in the last pages, about the 6B14 and state that the reinforcement for the 6B14 is made of 15 layers of aramid fabric. On the other hand, I have noticed personally when looking at some Soviet-era aramid fabric for some body armor that generally this aramid fabric is more or less around 150 grams per square meters of density. I do not know exactly what is the density of the aramid used for the 6B14, as I don't have one, but I will try to run some calculation based on these assumptions of 150 grams per square meter. I will assume that it is the same as the Soviet-era aramid, and I will also assume the 15 layers amount that Kalashnikov magazine said, and I will see if the result will give me a weight that is similar or far from the actual weight of the 6B14. If the weight is similar or very close, we will know that those assumptions are most likely to be true. If the result is very far, we know that it will be most likely to be false. We will begin by calculating the amount of aramid that will be used, assuming the two assumptions to be true, of course. And so we will begin. We know that the 6B14 has 10.5 square decimeter of protection surface. So it means 1050 square centimeter, which means that if we multiply that by 15 layers, we have 1.575 square meters of fabric, assuming no overlap. In fact, we would have probably more because each layer will need some cutting and some stitching and so some overlap that will increase the weight. But we will go from the principle that no overlap, that for some reason each layer of fabric is already a perfect dome before being placed, to simplify the calculation. So 1.575 square meter. by 150 grams. And so we got a total weight for aramid of 236 grams. Then, for the resin, since I have absolutely no idea about such matters regarding the resin, I decided to ask a friend. Take this out meow, which by the way I have his own YouTube channel, and I will put a link in the description under this video. He's a close friend of mine and he helped me with that one. So we will base ourselves on the assumption that a resin equivalent to epoxy resin is used. So a resin with a density and a strength similar to get similar weight. And so my friend explained me, take this out meow, explained to me that a 50-50 weight ratio is not unheard of. It is not unrealistic to expect such thing, especially for a ballistic helmet. So basically, if we base ourselves on this information, it means that the weight of resin will be equal, more or less equal to the weight of aramid. And since the weight of aramid was 236 grams, it means that we can expect realistically to have the same for resin, and so have 236 grams of resin on top of the 236 grams of aramid, which would bring us with a total of 472 grams for the composite liner of the 6B14. So now, let's take into account the fact that a 6B14 has a weight comprised between 1.7 kilograms and 1.9 kilograms according to most sources. We know a basic SSH60 has a weight of around 1.3 kilograms. Let's add the weight of our theoretical composite liner, which is 472 grams. It gives us a total of 1,772 grams, which is very close to the middle between the lowest and the highest values of weight for 6B14, which makes me think that the value given by Kalashnikov magazine at around 15 layers and the density I think will be the most likely to be true at 150 grams per square meter are both true, because the result we got from the calculation based on those two assumptions is very spot on with the weight that most sources give us regarding the 6B14. It is also worth noting that the composite fabric I will be using for the modified VZ53 will be UHMVP with a density of 160 grams per square meter, which, layer per layer, should be superior to the 150 grams per square meter aramid that the Russians used in the 2000. And so, we should have at least as much protection, if not more, if using the same amount of layers. For this specific build, I decided to use 12 layers of the 160 GSM UHMVP. Theoretically, 9 layers should offer as much protection as 15 layers of the 150 GSM aramid, but I preferred to put a bit more material to have an extra margin of safety. Each layer of the UHMVP soft liner will be made of 3 pieces, one central piece being 50 cm long by 25 cm width, and the 2 side pieces being 25 cm width by 30 cm length. You will probably notice that such dimensions allow for a wide surface of overlap, which is important to have in order to prevent projectiles from slipping between 2 pieces of UHMVP if they land near enough the edge of one of the pieces. As you can see, the UHMVP can prove quite challenging to cut with normal scissors. Its flexibility and smoothness tend to allow it to glide right between the scissors blades. However, after trying multiple postures and way of holding both the scissors and the UHMVP, I found out that folding the UHMVP in packs of between 2 and 4 layers will reduce its ability to slip between the scissors blades. And if on top of that you hold it firmly and try to make the edges of your scissors blade go back and forth, instead of trying to brute force it perpendicularly to the material, as if you were cutting a thick piece of cardboard, you will allow for a better and much cleaner cut, as trying to brute force often results in pulling some of the fiber out of the UHMVP and making a more dirty and inappropriate cut. After having cut enough pieces to do 6 layers, remember that with this design and dimension, most of the surface will have at least 2, sometimes even 3 layers overlapping, meaning 12 layers are already achieved on most of the surface, and overlapped surface being enough to avoid projectile slipping through without having to actually pierce the material, and having enough left over for some reinforcement on non-overlapped layers, reinforcement needing to be themselves bigger than non-overlapped area to avoid having weak spot on the rims between 2 areas, we can now begin to lay down the basic pieces within the now empty shell of the helmet. The laying method I chose can be relatively long and tedious, but is simple and does not need any specific tooling, using mainly the fact that the UHMVP, once folded and pressed strongly enough into shape, tend to have, to a certain degree, some kind of shape memory. I did place pieces in groups of 2, so 2 central and 2 per side, and then resuming all over again until 6 pieces of each emplacement have been placed. Once the basic pieces have been laid properly and are conforming to the helmet's shape, I would by the way recommend to take the required time to push properly against the helmet using your hands, and if you have a spare helmet, using the spare helmet in order to push inside, in order to avoid having a huge empty space between the steel shell and the UHMVP, or between the multiple layers of UHMVP, as you do not want to waste inside volume. You can begin to apply some duct tape in order to keep the pieces sticking together and acting as a single liner instead of separate pieces. Once you have all the pieces of your inside liner being properly duct taped to each other, and so your liner of your HMVP act as a single piece instead of separate pieces, you can begin to cut the extra unneeded material on the rim to have your UHMVP liner to have the same rim shape and same profile as the steel shell in order to fit properly and not have too much going out to the side. After that, I proceeded to prepare the reinforcement pieces I talked about previously. They were 6 layers thick and were larger than the non-overlapped area in order to not have weak spot. Those pieces were then placed on the non-overlapped area of the shell and duct taped to it. They were placed on the exterior side. After everything was properly installed, cut, duct taped and pressed, we end up with a new HMVP inner shell that, from every direction, will have at least 12 layers of thickness and no weak spot susceptible to let a projectile slip through without having to actually penetrate the 12 layers of material. We can then proceed with making sure that the inner side of the steel shell is ready to receive its upgrade. Let's first install our inner composite shell until everything fits perfectly, and get the tip of a pen through the steel shell's hole from the outside, in order to be able to make small marks on the UHMVP shell on the exact spots in front of the shell's hole. We can then remove the UHMVP inner shell. Then, let's make sure that there is no rust or any dust or anything dirty remaining on the inner side of the steel shell. We will then make sure that it is fully protected from any future rusting by adding paint. My shell was in good condition, so I only had to re-put a layer of paint. While your paint is drying, take something metallic, sturdy and pointy, like a knife, a pointy scissor, or something of that nature, and begin to use it by small rotational movement to slowly drill holes in your UHMVP shell. Don't hesitate to wear thick protection gloves and beware to not harm yourself during this process. When the paint of the inner side of the shell is completely dry and ready, and that your UHMVP liner is successfully pierced, you can then begin to cover it with double-sided tape. Choose one that is thin enough to not waste space inside the helmet. Once you have covered enough of the UHMVP's outer surface with double-faced tape, insert it properly into the steel shell in such a way that the holes you previously drilled in are aligned with the steel shell's hole and that both shells fit perfectly with each other. Once your steel shell and your UHMVP shell are properly in place, perfectly fitting with each other, and that the double-faced tape maintains them properly glued to each other, you can begin to take some bolts and to bolt the shells together in order to keep them locked in place to prevent them from moving. Do not tighten the bolt too much yet, as you will later need to remove and place once again each of them one by one later. We will now attack making the attachment point for the chin strap. We will now begin by getting some thick nylon straps. We will need a short strip for testing purposes and 3 longer ones that are approximately twice the length between the holes and the shell's rim, and either some plastic pieces, or, if you lack them, you can use 2 metal rings instead of each pieces, like the key holders rings for example, as those can be bought in bulk for cheap from the internet, and follow a double D ring pattern. It is worth noting that if the strips you use are made of nylon, you can prevent the cutted area from unweaving itself by slightly mating it with the heat of a small flame, like using a lighter. Out of the 3 long stripes, 2 will be installed on a plastic piece, or around 2 metal rings if you want to use them as a substitute, and the third one simply folded on itself around the width of the shorter 4th strip. The long strips will then receive a bit of stitching to keep them locked on their plastic pieces, and keeping the third one folded on itself. Once the stitching done, then drill holes in the unused extremities of those strips. And once that's done, remove one of the bolts from the helmet shell, place the strip on the inner side and put the bolt through both the strip, the UHMVP and the steel, and then bolt the three things together strongly and tightly. Redo that process twice for the two other long strips and you are done. The three further attachment points for the shield strap have been successfully bolted in place, and the UHMVP liner is now secured in place on the inside of the steel shell. Now that the three attachment points of the future shin straps are secured and that the inner UHMVP shell will no longer have to be moved or bent in any way, you can use more double-face tape to secure it even more sturdily to the inner side of the steel shell. Once that's done and your UHMVP stick even more strongly to the steel, you will be able to cover the wall surface of the UHMVP with grey duct tape, the goal being to shield it from light and moisture, as polymer and synthetic fibers tend to slowly, as years go on, lose some of their strength when exposed to either UVs, like sunlight for example, and moisture. So, keep something to shield them from the outside world can be a good idea to increase their lifespan. Do not forget to duct tape the rim of the two shells together as well, to prevent peeling, as well as preventing other small bits of potential random things from getting stuck between the steel and the UHMVP. Now that the UHMVP is properly covered against light and moisture, we can begin to work on the padding system. As I do not have one of those high-speed, low-drag operator tactical helmets in my collection, and those type of helmet pad doesn't visually look as thick as the inner padding of an old Sphera helmet, I was pretty clueless about what thickness of foam would be appropriate for a helmet that has a high deformation composite material in its composition. Fortunately for me, one of my friends over Discord happened to have such helmets and was kind enough to provide me photos with measurements in millimeter of his pad's thickness, so thank you Gopnik. I later also gave a look at what thicknesses are more common within some other types of helmet, which are known for being reliable protection-wise, such as Altin and SSH40 and according to the people in Discord who had the time to take some picture and measurement for me, it seems that my initial idea of putting a total of 15mm of foam wasn't outside of the scope of what is usually done in both Western composite design and in Eastern metal composite hybrids, which is good news for me. I therefore chose to make my pads the following way: 3 layers of 5mm thick foam. By the way, thank you Tech for the viscoelastic foam you sent me about a year ago, and making a total of 15mm of foam thickness, and a stiffer outer layer made of 4 layers of epoxy laminated 240 GSM aramid fabric, this outer layer's role being to spread over the impact caused by the UHMVP's BFD, in order to make it easier for the foam after it to absorb all this energy. After having planned the exact shape and dimension for each foam pad, I recommend you using paper or cardboard to make mock-ups first in order to be certain and to make proper adjustment, particularly for the top pad, whose thickness will define how high the helmet will sit on your head. I began to make the foam pads themselves. Fairly simple process consisting of just cutting the foam with scissors and duct taping the foam layers together, and then attacked the aramid epoxy lamination. For the aramid epoxy lamination, I simply prepared 2 thin pieces of sheet metal that I bent with the correct curvature and covered both with tape, as it will stick less than the raw metal. You can use plastic shopping bags, as epoxy stick far less to it than on most other materials as well. And then I did a classic lamination, where I did lay each layer of aramid down on the lower metal sheet, covered the aramid in epoxy, added the next layer of aramid, and so on, until the 4 layers of aramid were placed and soaked with epoxy resin, and then proceeded to put the second sheet metal above it, sandwiching the aramid epoxy between 2 sheets of metal, and then used clamp to compress and keep the whole thing under pressure for multiple days. And then, once epoxy dried up and cured, I took the clamps and the sheet of metal apart and made the next lamination, and so on until I had 1 aramid epoxy laminated piece for each pad. Then, I did cut each laminated pieces to the exact size and shape I needed, using scissors. I had to force, but it was still manageable, as 4 layers is still something relatively thin. After all the aramid epoxy plates were cured and cut to dimension, I then added them to the exterior side of the foam pad, and then duct taped everything into full units. Then I covered those units with a layer of adhesive cloth, which is relatively similar to duct tape, with the main difference being the exterior texture being far closer to actual cloth, which makes it more suited than duct tape for direct contact with the head and preventing skin irritation. When each pad was done, I began to lay down double-faced tape on the inside of the shell and began to place the pad in their place, one by one, beginning by the top one and then doing the others. Now that the pads are all done and installed properly, we can take care of the exterior side of the bolts. I took my hacksaw and did cut down the excessive length part of the bolt that stuck out of the shell too much. After having cut them, I used abrasive cloth, aka sandpaper, to grind the cut area to get them to be smooth and touch. Once the bolts being taken care of, I did add a bit of adhesive cloth on the rim of the helmet to cover the part of the duct tape that is on the outside part of the shell, since I have noticed that the paint I use turned to stick better on adhesive cloth than duct tape, and so proceeded to paint the exterior of the helmet. With the exterior having been finished, the only thing that was still unfinished was the chin strap. I made a very long and relatively short nylon strap. The long one will be the lateral strap that goes from the left to the right, and the short one will be bent and have its extremities stitched perpendicularly to the longer strip to become a chin cup. We can then cut the longer strip in one of the sides, a certain distance after the chin cup, in order to place detachable piece that will be useful to enable a quick release, which will make the chin strap much more convenient to put on and off once finished. If you do not have those kind of plastic bits, it is possible with enough work and accuracy to use bits of scrap metal to do a quick release hook, like it is done on the Hungarian M70 helmet, for example. Once it is done, then another nylon strip can be cut, and like usual, its extremities heated in a flame to avoid it from fraying, and one of its ends tied around a plastic piece, or, if non-available, 2 rings to do a double D-ring tightening system, while the other end will be wrapped around the lateral straps, the lateral strap being the one that goes from the right to the left. Once it is done, it is time for the final component. Make another long strap, and this time let one side without any stitch, just as it is, only heated to avoid fraying. Wrap and stitch the other side around a side of the lateral strap. Other side as previous piece, of course, and make sure it is not too tight. It needs to be able to wrap around the quick release mechanism and goes from one side to the other of it, and have the unstitched bit going through the back attachment point and into the plastic bits of the previous piece that was completed. Once all of that is done, the chin strap is now finished and only need to be adjusted to the wearer's head. Now that we have finished the 3-point chin strap with a chin cup and a quick release, the helmet is basically over. You can now add whatever camouflage pattern or fabric cover that is needed to operate it, and if you have done things closely enough compared to the way I have, the helmet's final weight should be between 1.9 and 2 kilograms, which is similar weight range as the Russian kolpak-20, from which this helmet is based off. Given the fact that I built this one using a Visit 53 shell and that I finished the build in early 2023, I decided to call this particular one the Visit 5323. Let's now inspect our finished helmet. As you can see, the foam pads are thick and relatively firm, which is not the most optimal for comfort, but good to diminish potential head trauma that could be caused by the UHMVP's BFD. Upon trying it, we can see that the shin strap does its job and holds tightly the helmet in place, preventing it from moving too much or falling. The helmet shell, however, sits higher than how I usually like to wear them. I probably went a bit overboard with the top pad thickness, as you probably saw previously, I doubled the thickness, which was a mistake from my part. Which is why I recommend you to first try with various cardboard mock-ups of various thicknesses in order to find the right thickness combo for you, in order to have the shell sit properly and exactly where you want. It is also worth noting that on various pictures I could find online of social conscript wearing the kolpak-20, the shell seemed to be sitting similarly high on the head, so I guess that even in this regard I haven't done worse than the Russians themselves. Notice also how the back strips of the shin strap can move up and down freely. It is very important as it allows to properly adjust where the retention is gonna be, allowing to adjust your shin strap to your skull shape. Overall, I did my best and believe I have reached my objective, which was to deliver an upgrade for SSH40 and SSH60 that is at least equivalent, if not better, than the Russian kolpak-20, while being simple enough to be easily replicated by the people in Ukraine. This improvised upgrade is of course not meant to compete with modern composite helmets, such as the Casca-1M, the WZ2000 or the ACH, but will at least be an affordable solution that still does better than a basic non-upgraded steel helmet. I hope that it will be useful and hopefully save someone. Until then, have a good one and see you in the next video.